Salam, salam, inshallah, everyone is doing well. A little visit from the library. Now I'm going to do something a little bit different. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about an academic kind of scholarly process that I've been involved with for about a year, and it might be a little bit longer. I'll also be giving several book recommendations. I have all of the books in front of me that I'm going to recommend except one. I seem to have misplaced it, which happens to be the most important book I want to recommend. I just came back from Jordan, where I have been on the steering committee for a little less than a year to produce this conference, which is called International Consultation on Understanding Christian Zionism and its Effects on Christians in the Middle East. And this conference, which I've been on the steering committee of because my organization, the logo is here, the Royal Al-Bayt Institute for Islamic Thought, of which I'm the general director. We are one of the co-sponsors of the conference, along with Dar al-Kalima University in Bethlehem. What was interesting is that this conference actually took place at the actual baptismal site of Jesus Christ alayhi salam, and we actually began the conference with a beautiful mini pilgrimage, that took the walkway of John the Baptist all the way to the spot where Christ alayhi salam was baptized. Of course, I was one of, I think, only 3 Muslims in the whole conference, one of 2 Muslims on the steering committee, and I think there was a 3rd Muslim guest. So for me, it's completely out of my element. I mean, I don't know much about this topic, but I'm very happy to have been supportive of this topic for the following reasons. A little bit of the work that I do throughout the year. Unfortunately, not a lot because time and resources don't permit it, but a little bit of the work, I would say about 10% of my work throughout the year, is to help attend to the needs of religious minorities in Arab countries, which usually basically ends up being Christians, being the largest religious minority in Arab countries or Muslim majority countries. It's something that I believe is strongly about because I believe it's a religious obligation before it's a national obligation in whichever country I'm working with, and to make sure that their needs are met, their places of worship are safe, they have enough places to worship, all the kind of things that are involved with that. Now, this is something that came to us where a lot of the Arab Christian churches, ever since the genocide in Gaza has been taking place, unfortunately, they have reached out to us to say, look, we need help because we are a dying breed. And one of the Arab Christian leaders at the conference, I can't remember who it was, but they're saying that they estimate by 2050 there will no longer be any Arab Christians in the West Bank, in cities that are historically Christian, places like Jericho, Bethlehem, of course, parts of Jerusalem, etc., which is a very sad thing to hear. I did not realize that it was that bleak. So they came to us to ask for our support in putting together this conference. I want to give you kind of my take on it as an outsider that's not really directly involved. I think of this topic, from what I heard, all the presentations, there are 3 kind of buckets of information, and these 3 buckets of information are produced from my bias as a trained Islamic jurist and usuli. This is how I think about problems, especially how I think about extremism within Islam, which is there is a problem usually with understanding the text, fahm al-nusus. There's a problem with understanding the context, idrak al-waqa', and there's a difficulty in bringing the text into the context, tadbiq al-nas fil waqa'. And using that kind of tripartite scheme, that's how I was able to make sense of the conference. The first thing is about the texts, the interpretations / misinterpretations of the text. Unfortunately, not a lot was said about that topic. And when I pushed a lot of my Christian brothers and sisters, on the breaks and coffee breaks and the lunch and the dinner and breakfast and whatnot, can you just have a session on just how the Bible, either the Gospels or the Torah, are interpreted or, in your opinion, misinterpreted by Christian Zionists? The best I could get was that's already been done, and they sent me down the path on some resources which I have yet to. I wrote them down in my notebook. I haven't had a chance to look up. But that's really, really important for me because there's got to be a hermeneutical way of dealing with that. Is there a passage in the gospel that supports the Christian Zionist movement, or passages? Are there passages in the Torah, or as the Christians refer to as the Old Testament, that support the notions and the beliefs of Christian Zionists. Of course, Christian Zionists say there are. Everyone at the conference, without, from the Patriarch of Jerusalem all the way down, they said that this is a heresy and it's heretical. They talked about it being a confessional issue, something that can remove somebody from the faith altogether. I mean, very strong words. So if they're that strong words, I'm also looking as an outsider, will show me what the mistake is in interpretation. Now, I think that maybe it's a very entry-level question, so maybe that's why they didn't deal with it. But for me, that's very important, that I'm still seeking for that. Just like when people reach out to me that are not Muslim, and they're the ISIS this and al-Qaeda that and all these extremists, and I'm like, that's not Islam. I can't just say that's not Islam. I got to show them, that's actually not what the Quran says. Or this verse is like a partial verse. Or they claim that this is a text, but it's actually not even a text at all. It's just something that they've inherited. So I can point out, I can come in a surgical way, and I can say this is the problem with the interpretation of the text. So that's the first kind of bucket, which for me is the most important, because that's the way my mind, but that's just a personal thing. I kind of found that a little bit lacking, although there were snippets of it, and in their defense, I think it was just too much of a freshman level question. The second bucket is understanding the context. And in that regard, there was a session, let me just read you the title of the session, Christian Zionism, Settler Archaeology, and the Threat to Jerusalem. Unfortunately, this session took place after lunch, and it was a very large lunch, so I think a lot of people were kind of on snooze. But it was very, very fascinating. Unfortunately, archaeology is not something that I know a lot about. I think I took one class on archaeology when I was in grad school, when I was a master's student even. And it had to do with ancient Egypt archaeology, which is kind of, I guess, the stereotypical archaeology. And being Egyptian, it made sense. But a completely fascinating topic. Of course, you think of Indiana Jones and all of that, but it's much more academic. And I had no idea of the politicization of archaeology. And unfortunately, sometimes they're just outright lies. I mean, there are archaeologists that will lie and manipulate the data. And thankfully, there are honest archaeologists. By the way, honest Israeli archaeologists as well. I mean, a lot of the authoritative archaeologists that were being mentioned in the conference were Israeli. So this has nothing to do about you're on this side or that side. It's just sort of the academic integrity and scholarship that is required for that field, as we would expect of any field. I mean, I hope that when you ask me a question, you assume that I'm honest enough to give you what I think is the honest answer and don't sugarcoat it. Anyway, that was very important. And related to that is the history of the Levant itself, the ancient history of the Levant itself. And this is the kind of, let me just interject two type of documents that I think are very important. One organization I'm not directly in charge of it, but it's like a sister organization. It's called the Royal Islamic Strategic Studies Center, or RISC. And we have a couple of publications on Jerusalem. This one, Keys to Jerusalem. And by the way, you can go to the website and download this for free if you don't want to buy the actual book. It's not even that long. I mean, the book that I have in my hand is 92 pages, including the extra stuff. But this is a very important little booklet, I would say, or book, that talks about the history of the Levant, who are the original inhabitants, establishing from even not just historical texts, but texts of scripture, being the Hebrew Bible, and moving forward about the Canaanites being, i.e. the Arabs being the original inhabitants, and things like that. And that's kind of important. And then it goes down to the history through the different dynasties, including the Jewish dynasty, and then the Romans, the Byzantines, and then the Islamic/Arab. It's very important because there is a strong effort, as the session mentioned, to try to manipulate some archaeological findings to fit a certain ideology, rather than approaching archaeology as let's see what we find and then deduce from what we find the deductions, rather than coming in with a bias, trying to find certain things and then forcing ourselves to see those certain things to define or to support a certain history. And both sides, I think, of the conflict are going to be guilty of that. One side is probably more guilty than the other, but that's very important, the context. So the archaeology was an important issue. Also, the history of Christians in the region in general, and then the history of Arab Christians more specifically. And that's unfortunately a problem in the West, that there is this bias amongst Christians in the West, I mean, of Europe and North America, that there's an assumption that, you know, Christianity is like this white man's kind of religion or European religion, where it's not. It doesn't, that's an import. It comes from the Holy Land. And these Arab Christians are very passionate and very proud of being the inheritors of that tradition. And they are, you know, very much under attack, and their places of worship are under attack, their way of life is under attack. And specifically from the basic human rights, freedom of religion, freedom of movement point of view, that's a problem that needs to be addressed by people that have the ability to address it. Also, another issue about the context that the conference spent a lot of time talking about is colonialism and genocide. And there were a lot of, you know, links to colonial theology, subjectivity. I'm just reading you some of the theology of genocide. And the like. So understanding the current context, that was done very well at the conference, because I learned a lot, and I'm kind of judging it as an outsider. I did read for about a year as much as I could in the topic. I'll get to some more recommendations now. But as an outsider who had very little information, it's one of those things where it was kind of like compounded ignorance, because I did not know that I did not know that much about this topic. That part of the conference and the interventions, I think, were done very well. So there was the scriptural part, which I thought was lacking, which I need. There's the context part, which I thought was very well. And then there is how the interpretation, a specific interpretation of the texts or the primary sources in Christianity are used to apply to the context to justify certain political moves, actions, and whatnot. And of course, that was kind of weaved in throughout the gathering as well. We talked about settler movements, we talked about immigration, talked about political support in the West, primarily from the United States, and the like. Of course, the whole conference was undergirded by the challenge of defining Christian Zionism, which is something which is, you know, it's a new topic. I think only in the last couple of decades has it actually been talked about in the American Academy of Religions, AAR, which is the largest gathering of academics and theologians in North America, or one of the largest, that is. So there's not obviously one unified definition, but it's basically Christians and Christian churches trying to support the modern state of Israel and its expansion at the cost of all of these people on the ground, which is mostly, in this case, the concern was Christians in the Middle East. So I learned a lot. I didn't have to present any paper because I didn't have the requisite knowledge to present a paper. I did chair one of the sessions, but that was just sort of like being a referee. And I learned a lot. I took a lot of notes. I met a lot of wonderful people. There were Christian activists and theologians from all over the world, not just from North America. I'd love to reconnect with my Arab Christian brothers and sisters from the region. And you know, we see them far too seldom, so I'm very happy I was able to do that. But as a person who loves knowledge and who loves to read and loves to learn and loves to, you know, face challenging topics, it was a refreshing thing for me to be just totally out of my element and forced to learn. Now, of course, like anybody else, I've done my basic reading on the topic that I thought especially when the Gaza genocide started, to kind of re-familiarize myself with the history. So I want to give you a couple of recommendations of books that I have read that helped me. And I also want to talk a little bit about how I think if you want to buy these books or if you want to read them, how you should read them, because you have to be able to read with a critical eye. Not everything you'll be kind of maybe surprised by some of the sources that I show you. The first one is a book that I stumbled upon when I was a freshman in college, either a senior in high school or freshman in college, A Peace to End All Peace, The Fall of the Ottoman Empire and the Creation of the Modern Middle East by David Fromkin. This is a very good book. Now, it's dated. He's obviously very biased against the Arabs. You know, the Arabs are like these fumbling bozos in the desert that are just like anything that flashes and shiny. Ooh, you know, like that stereotype. I mean, that's definitely, you can't escape that. But that's great because the people that he's quoting, you know, and you got to be able to look at the sources, the notes at the end. I mean, I always have a second bookmark, on the notes in the back or on the bottom of the page so I can see. It kind of interrupts the reading, I understand, but that's important. The sources that he quotes from that are a lot of sources from the time, like people's diaries, Winston Churchill and those type of people. That's how they viewed the Arabs at the time. And there is this complete bias that the Arabs are just these very backward people and very simple-minded people then and now. Unfortunately, that's very much the case, and it's very hard to escape that perspective. But this book is wonderful because this is the story. If you're an Arab, if you're a young Muslim, this is the story that you need to understand. You have to understand what happened with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and how all of these modern nation states came to be, even the flags and the color of the flags that came from designers in Europe. It's very important to understand that history and to seek some of the alliances that happened as requisite knowledge. Again, you have to read it with a critical eye. You got to chuckle. You can't just read it as the gospel truth. There are going to be some points of bias. Another book that I read early on was Rashid Khalidi's The 100-Year War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017. Again, Rashid is a very well-known professor. I think he just retired. Kind of the other perspective, but also biased. I mean, very disparaging about Palestinian leadership, political leadership, probably rightfully so. The corruption of these people and a lot of the story he was part of. So I mean, and his father, rahimahullah, was also a part of, I think, the delegation of the United Nations. So he has a lot of insider knowledge. But very sad book. I mean, that book particularly, I felt so defeated after reading. Like, man, this is so. We have a mountain of problems. Another book. This one is a little bit out of my depth because there's a lot of requisite knowledge that I just did not have and still do not have. But Dr. Robert Smith, who was my partner on the steering committee, he wrote More Desired Than Our Own, Salvation, The Roots of Christian Zionism. So this is not a long book. I believe this was an outgrowth of Dr. Smith's PhD dissertation. But kind of emerging as like the main text that talks about Christian Zionism today. And again, there's just unfortunately a lot of these like micro Christian movements. I don't know what they mean. So I had to have Wikipedia up next to me as I would just to make sense. But an absolutely indispensable book on the topic. To return again to sort of my own organization, the Royal Al-Bayt Institute for Islamic Thought, we put out this white paper. I believe it's also available for download. The Hashemite Custodianship of Jerusalem's Islamic and Christian Holy Sites, 1917 to 2020. Now, the reason that this document is important is it proves, with evidence and a lot of the original facsimiles of the original agreements and signed, that the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan has the custodianship of the Aqsa Mosque and its complex, including what is referred to by Jews as the Wailing Wall, which we refer to as Ha'at al-Buraq, and of course a lot of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and a lot of the other Christian sites inside Jerusalem. And this was acknowledged by the Israelis in their peace agreement with Jordan in the 90s. So this is also a very important part of just modern history to understand why Jordan is concerned with these holy sites and whatnot. Now, the one author, I gotta say though, that tops all of this, that for me was one of the biggest eye-opening moments into how important this concept of Christian Zionism is, and how in a way it even predates Jewish Zionism, which I didn't even know was possible, was the author, American Zionist author, Barbara Tuchman. Now, unfortunately, I don't have her book in front of me, which is Bible and the Sword. But let me just tell you how I learned about her book. I was in a bookstore in Singapore, and I was talking with the owner, Tahir, and we were talking about what we're reading. And he said, I'm reading this book by Barbara Tuchman, The Guns of August. And he said, this is the book, which is a this is about sort of how Europe blundered into World War I. And he was telling me, I did not know this, that this book was so important to John F. Kennedy that he bought dozens of copies, and he made all of the Joint Chiefs and all of his staff and advisors read this book. And he cites this book as one of the reasons why he was able to avoid war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I was like, okay, well, that's a good enough endorsement for me to want to read the book. So when I came back to the States and I got on Amazon and I put in her name, this book came up, and then the next one was Bible and the Sword, the history of, England and the Holy Land or something like that from like the Bronze Age. I was like, whoa, that looks really interesting. So of course I got both books and I started to read her, but I had no idea about her. And then when I started reading the book, well, first of all, she's a fantastic author, so she's a good writer. And number two, unlike a lot of the modern polemical writers, whether they be Zionist or anti-Zionist, she's very honest and transparent. And I say that's very important. Maybe people will be offended, but unfortunately, and I'm self-criticizing, even people from my own side of the story are not very honest when they talk about the problem. Like when people want to criticize Israel, the state, but then they'll say like anti-Semitic tropes, or they'll say all Jews this or all Jews that. And I always point out that's different. We can't, that's impermissible for us to do that. Just like the Christians, we respect them as people of the book, so do we respect the Jews as the people of the book, and actually all pre-Islamic religions for that matter, because the people of the book is a larger concept than just the Abrahamic faiths. So you read in some of the writings and some of the things that are on social media, they're duplicitous. People that are pro-Palestinian. And definitely people that are pro-Israel and pro-Zionist, modern people, completely duplicitous in what they say. She is not. Very, very honest writer. And that was very, very refreshing. The Bible and the Sword I think, is such a good book. I have bought probably half a dozen copies since, and I've given them to people that I think should read it and are interested, because it shows how far back the concern within Protestant Christianity is for Jews and the Holy Land in different manifestations, in different ways. But this is not something that came yesterday. This is something that goes back to the time of the Puritans, the Dutch Puritans for that matter, which really blew my mind. I actually had to almost read the book twice to kind of understand and comprehend how far back it goes. As a student of comparative religions, of course, I learned about the Reformation and all of that. I never came across that. They never taught me any of that. So for me, it was like, wait, what did I just read? And I have to go back, and she has fantastic references. You can download, most of those are old, like several 100-year books. I download them as PDF, kind of would sift through them, just to kind of get the high level of them, and to see how far back the concern is amongst particularly Protestant Christianity with the Holy Land. A lot of that has to do with maybe Christian guilt. A lot of that has to do, I have to be honest, with pure hatred of Arabs and Muslims. I mean, that's just the case because Islam was a dominant political empire force in that part of the world for several centuries. The Crusades and whatnot and things like that, and Salah ad-Din and all of that, I mean, that was definitely a motivation. I mean, it's inescapable from the writing. And unfortunately, that bias, as I said, it existed today. I mean, as an Arab American, I mean, I received all that kind of vitriol growing up, and people have said horrendous things to me about my race and my background, my religion. I mean, alhamdulillah, I've outgrown that. I don't think I have the trauma of it, but I definitely know what it's like to have those things thrown your way. Anyway, that's for another time. I don't want this to be a psychiatry session. So part of it had to do with hatred, and part of that had to do with this kind of concern with messianism. And all of those components, if you just abstract them out from the current issue of the state of Israel and the Palestinian people and whatnot, those are problems that all religions have. All religions have issues of messianism. All religions have issues of, a kind of we are better than others that exists, unfortunately. It can come out very easily. And all religions have a problem, a hermeneutical problem, in how they hold to the text, their primary text, whether they change them, they erase them, they edit them, they reinterpret them, etc. So as a scholar of religion, that's very important for me, and was very stimulating for me to see it applied to something other than Islam for a change. So that's what I've been involved with for about a little less, maybe like, let's just say the last year, on the steering committee to help bring these components together, to bring these church leaders together, to hear the difficulties of the Arab Christian, the Palestinian Christians specifically, to hear the frustration of other leaders of other churches, particularly in Europe, at a lot of it is the American Christian Protestant scene, and its kind of disregard for their fellow Christians in the Holy Land. And it was nice to be in something that's challenging, because I didn't really know a lot of this. A lot of what I'm saying now, I'm still kind of evolving in my learning of it. And learning never ceases, and you got to take the opportunities when they come. So I feel very blessed to have been a part of that, to be in that holy spot, the baptism site of Christ alayhi salam, to spend 3-4 days with people of faith, another faith, but people of faith nonetheless. I learned a lot, was challenged. I gave some contributions, via questions, and I'm very interested to see how the participants kind of go on and take a lot of what they learned and a lot of what they exchanged and kind of operationalize them in different sorts of projects with their community. Anyway, so a little bit different kind of video, but I just wanted to give you guys a little digest of that time, that event, and some book recommendations. I hope that you will find them useful. If none of them are float your boat, I highly recommend you read Tuckman's Bible and the Sword. Very, very important and very, very eye-opening. That's it for now. Be well, be safe. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.